This is TK Academy, which is Teen Knowledge for Architects and Designers. This is one of our core competency courses, which is a back to basics refresher. Today we're going to talk about one of the final stages of an architect's services, contract administration. And here are the learning objectives for this course. After completing this course, you'll be able to identify the 5 parts of a typical construction contract, explain the differences between general conditions and general requirements, identify the types of services that architects typically provide during construction, and list the 3 methods for issuing modifications to a construction contract. One could imagine that a construction contract can be very complex. Typical contract documents consist of 5 separate parts. The first part is the owner-contractor agreement. So this is the written contract between the owner and the general contractor, which specifies a contract time and a contract sum or dollar amount to perform the work. The AIA produces a standard form. It's A101, which is a standard form agreement between owner and contractor. This is one example. It's very common in the industry, but AIA publishes many other ones as well, whether it's design build, small project, sustainability project, CMGC, and so on. So that is part of the written agreement, and it consists of different parts. We have the general, supplemental, and special conditions. It includes performance bonds, labor and material bonds, and the certificate of insurance. Now, it is not recommended that architects prepare this. This is really more of a legal document, which would be better suited for a lawyer to prepare. But I do know that within the industry, many times architects do get involved with assembling and collecting the documents for assembly into this contract document. Contract documents also consist of the architect's construction drawings and specifications. So that is our contribution to the contract, is producing what is going to be built and the quality of which is to be built by. Addenda, which is often also called bid addenda. This is when the contract is bidding. Any additional information, whether it's questions that are being asked during the bidding process, or corrections, or sometimes even additional work, things that were not completed at the time when the project went out to bid. This is published by the architect as a bid addenda. The important thing to note on this is that the addenda must be distributed to all bidders. So if you're receiving questions, if a subcontractor calls and asks for a specific question on an issue, it is not advised to answer that directly. It is better to answer it in a published addenda and send out to everyone who is bidding it, so that there cannot be any disputes on having equal access to information or showing favoritism to any one bidder. And then finally, modifications. This is part of the contract documents that occur after construction has started, and this is to modify the existing contract. There are 3 ways of doing this. There's the Architect's Supplemental Instructions, an ASI, a change order, or a construction change directive. So all these parts together make up the contract documents for a project. As you can see, an architect has a very large role in assembling a lot of this information: the construction drawings, specifications, addenda, modifications, and in some cases even the actual written contract with the collection of bonds and insurance. That is why an architect is involved during construction, and the services are referred to as contract administration, not construction administration. The actual written part of the agreement between an owner and contractor can be very brief and limited in its content, but it does typically refer to other documents outside, and one of those is the general conditions of the contract. AIA publishes the document A201, which spells out the general conditions of the contract. This has been around for well over 100 years. Has become the industry standard. It has been tested in courts, stood the test of time, continually modified to keep up with current trends and changes within the industry. So this is a very important document for architects to know and understand. One of the things to point out is that the the written contract, the agreement between an owner and contractor, does not contractually bind the architect. The architect is not involved with that contract. However, the architect's role within the construction of the project is spelled out in this A201. What it identifies is that the architect becomes the owner's agent during construction. So let's talk about what that means here briefly. So during design, the architect is filling the role basically as a consultant or an advisor to the owner and developing the owner's project, developing the design for that. But when the project is bid and awarded to a general contractor for construction, now the architect's role changes to that of an agent, or being able to act on behalf of the owner in certain areas. So that's why this document is important. It spells that out, what the architect's role is, what their jobs that they're going to be doing during construction, and spells that out to the general contractor and the owner, so everyone understands what the architect's role and authority is during construction. So the important thing to note is that general conditions should never be modified. Again, this has been around for a long time, stood the test of time, it's been proven sound and true, and so we don't want to mess with this. Also, it's pretty well understood by all what everyone's roles and responsibilities are. So we don't change this document. If there are changes that have to be made, then we include another document which is called supplementary conditions. So supplementary conditions can add or subtract to that of the general conditions. One last thing I want to point out on this is that this often gets confused. The general conditions of the contracts gets confused with the general requirements of the contract, which are not the same. General requirements are in the specifications, and they are administrative in nature. They are not necessarily contractual. The general conditions of a contract will identify what the owner delegates to the architect in terms of roles and responsibilities to be performed during the construction of a project. The typical architectural services performed on the owner's behalf during construction include the following. The architect interprets the construction documents. The architect modifies the contract documents, and this is done with an architect's supplemental instructions, an ASI, a change order, or a construction change directive, a CCD. The architect may reject non-conforming work, and that is work that does not conform to the construction contract. This can maybe in terms of quantity, quality, color, performance, and so on. The architect will review the contractor's pay applications and recommend payments from the owner to the contractor. The architect will review the contractor's submittals. The architect responds to requests for information, or RFIs, and the architect must observe the work. Between the completion of the design of a project and before starting construction, the project must go through a plan review and receive a building permit. The architect's role in this is to submit the drawings and specifications to the authority having jurisdiction, AHJ, to begin the plan review process. The authority having jurisdiction may be the city, county, state, or federal. So it's important to know what jurisdiction you are working with in order to submit the plans and specifications to the proper level. Architects do not receive building permits. Building permits are issued by the authority having jurisdiction to the general contractor. So typically the general contractor must be licensed in order to pull a building permit. This cannot just be anybody who wants to self-perform the work. They actually have to be licensed in order to receive the building permit. The reviewed drawings and specifications through the plan review that are approved by the authority having jurisdiction, this is called the permit set. This is important that the permit set must always be located on the project site. After a project has bid, a construction contract has been executed between the owner and contractor, and the project has gone through a plan review and a building permit issued. Now we're able to start a pre-construction meeting. The pre-construction meeting should always be facilitated by the general contractor. There are a lot of items that are covered in this, a lot of documents that must be transferred to begin the project. Here's a list of several of these items that are covered. At the pre-construction meeting, the owner and architect should receive the schedule of values from the contractor. They should have a list of subcontractors that can be reviewed and approved. The construction schedule is established and reviewed. You can discuss the process of submitting submittals, RFIs, from the contractor to the architect. Discuss what the process of correspondence or communication is going to be on the project. How often are you going to have progress meetings, and so on. Discuss temporary controls. So erosion control, traffic control, safety and security. This is usually done in close correspondence between the contractor and the owner, especially if the place is going to be occupied during construction. Infection control measures. This is very important in most hospital or medical settings where you have to control the risk of infection from construction debris. Just to note that sometimes this includes noise, and when work can be performed without noise being problematic to operations or to a patient's comfort. The established contractor work area, also sometimes called the bed down, where they're going to set up their temporary job trailer, what type of utilities are they going to be able to use, where materials are going to be stored, and so on. Discuss future progress meeting dates, times, frequencies, and locations. So this is usually the first meeting of several that will occur during the progress of the project. The construction bonds should be issued at this time, as well as the certificates of insurance. If these have not been covered already in the construction contract, they need to be established during the pre-construction meeting and issued to the owner. And then the owner typically issues the notice to proceed, which is the authority to proceed with the construction schedule and begin construction of the project. We're going to go into some of these items in a little bit more detail. The first one we're going to cover is the list of subcontractors. So this is the formalized list of major subcontractors and vendors that the general contractor is intending or proposing to use to perform the work. There is AIA produces a standard document for this. It is G705. The purpose of this is to let the owner and architect know who's being intended for use and give them a chance to review for acceptance or objection if there's been any past performance issues on prior work or other things that are negative. The owner and architect have an opportunity to voice objection to that before the general contractor enters into a formal contractual agreement with those subcontractors. From the list of subcontractors, the general contractor is able to prepare the schedule of values. The schedule of values is a breakdown list of all the subcontractors' amounts and the values of materials and equipment that the contractor has compiled that make up the total contract sum of the work being performed. There are standard forms from this that the AIA produces in documents G702 and 703. What this does is creates a baseline for all the contracts, subcontracts in the project. This is typically updated and included with all payment applications from the general contractor, and the architect is able to review the payment application with the schedule of values to determine the type of work that has been completed and the percentage of that work that has been completed to see if the contractor is invoicing the proper amount for payment. One of the more common documents used during construction is the RFI, the Request for Information. This is simply the formal correspondence between the architect and the contractor. It is used for clarification, not to commit action. So if the contractor has a question of what is intended, what was meant by the contract documents, the architect response should be to clarify that. The RFI cannot implement a design change because, again, the design documents are part of the contract. So an RFI response is not part of the contracts. It's not an official contract modification, or is it a part of the contract documents. So again, the RFI is just simply the correspondence, the question and answer that does not implement any type of change or modification. However, RFIs do become part of the official record documents of the project. Generally, architects should respond to the contractor's RFIs within 7 days from receiving it. Sometimes there are cases where an RFI response will take longer than that. If that is such the case, the architect should notify the general contractor that it is going to take more time and when to expect a response for their RFI. A key role that architects perform during the construction of a project is the review of submittals. When an architect produces their design documents, it conveys the design intent, but it does not get into the specifics of fabrication of certain products, components, or systems. That is the purpose of submittals. The manufacturers of these will submit their proposed fabrication, their product data, material samples, and so on to the general contractor, who then turns around and submits this to the architect for review for general compliance with the design intent indicated in the construction documents. The key takeaway here is that it is reviewed, not approved. So again, the architect is reviewing for general compliance with the construction documents. A review of a submittal does not relieve the contractor from compliance with the construction documents. So the reason for this is submittals are not part of the construction contract. So the construction contract is what is the general contractor is being held to comply with. So the term of approved submittal would designate some type of action on behalf of the architect that it meets the contract, and that's not part of the role here. Again, submittals are not part of the construction contract. Submittals, however, do become part of the final project record documents. Submittals are, again, received by the general contractor, who typically reviews them and then turns those to the designer record for their review. And within a reasonable amount of time, the architect reviews and returns the submittals. So the general conditions of a contract uses the phrase "a reasonable time." Generally, this is understood within the industry as about a 2-week period. Submittals are typically categorized as either action or informative submittals. Action requires an action by the designer of record, not to be confused with designating an action to the general contractor. This is an action that needs to be done by the designer of record. These include product data, shop drawings, and samples. So these are reviewed by the architect, usually marked up, some type of comment provided, something that authorizes the contractor to proceed based upon this review. The other type of submittals are informative. This just provides information or documentation to the designer of record. This includes certificates, qualifications, test and evaluation reports, and sustainability reports. These are also reviewed by the architect or designer of record, but it does not necessarily designate an action. If there are no issues with these submittals, they are simply accepted and filed as part of the project record documents. After a submittal has been reviewed by the designer of record, it is given an action category. There are typically in the industry about 5 different action categories, but this does vary from firm to firm, and the specifics of what each category means is usually spelled out in Division 1 specification underneath submittals. But again, in the industry, it's typically 5. The first 3 are reviewed and indicates that the contractor may proceed with the work as long as certain conditions are met. The last 2 are resubmit, which says that the contractor may not proceed. We have to have a resubmittal before this work can move forward. A is reviewed, no exceptions taken, essentially that there are no comments, no revisions. The contractor may proceed with the item as submitted. B is reviewed, furnished as corrected. The designer of record will make some small corrections, modifications, some clarifications, but generally the submittal is good to proceed with as long as those certain items are being addressed. C is reviewed, additional information required. Essentially, this is an incomplete submittal. We only had part of the information submitted that we need. Additional information is required before we can complete with this. So the contractor can proceed as long as we get this additional information to complete the submittal. D is a resubmit, revise and resubmit. So the specific product, system, material is generally acceptable, but the submittal is just missing information, not complete, not what was specified, or so on. So this is basically sending it back and saying, clean this up, clean up your submittal, complete it, and resubmit it. We'll review it then. And then E is resubmit, rejected. Essentially, what was submitted does not meet the design intent. It fails in a number of categories and is just not acceptable. So in this case, the general contractor will have to submit something different for the designer record to review. A submittal should have a submittal stamp put on it by the designer of record who's reviewing it. It will include what the action designation is, and then the designer of record should include a signature and the date that the review was complete and returned. Obviously, when one takes on something as complex and as expensive as a construction project, one is very concerned regarding the quality control. Designers of records will put requirements in the specifications for testing to ensure that the quality control is being met. These can generally fall into two categories of material testing and operational testing. The testing of materials and systems most of the time is performed by a third-party entity that is contracted directly with the owner. And this is to ensure that there is no biases or conflicts of interest in the testing of materials and systems. When the tests are completed, the test reports are sent to designers of record who review them to make sure that the materials and systems are meeting the performance requirements that were included in the project specifications. For material testing, this can include certain items like soil compaction density testing, concrete strength testing, and structural steel weld connection testings. These are very common, and a lot of these are required by building code and by the authorities having jurisdiction. Operational testing, sometimes this is put on the general contractor to do this, but again, it's always best to do it as a third party. Some of the items that can be included in operational testing is the initial system startup, the test and balance of the systems, and fire alarm testing. So what happens when a material or system fails to meet the minimum quality performance requirements? The architect has the authority to reject work that does not conform to the contract documents. So if there is a performance requirement minimum included in the project specifications, if the report comes from the testing agency that indicates it does not meet that minimum performance, the architect or designer of record has the authority to reject that work. What happens then? The general contractor must repair or replace that non-conforming work without additional compensation. So essentially the general contractor must pay to redo that work. Only the owner has the authority to accept non-conforming or poor quality work. The architect or designer of record is not permitted to do so. So the architect has the authority to reject that work on behalf of the owner, but if the owner, they decide to accept that, they're the only ones who can do that. The architect cannot make that decision, and the owner has the authority to override the architect to accept non-conforming or poor quality work. It should be noted, though, that this is in terms of general quality, and if it affects something in terms of life safety, then the authority of jurisdiction is not going to do that, and the owner does not have the authority to override the authority having jurisdiction. What happens if the architect rejects work that is later to be found compliant with the contract documents? Well, then it comes upon the architect to pay for the difference to having that work repaired or replaced. A good example of this is if something is concealed like behind a wall or something that or above a ceiling. If the architect feels that there may be some non-conforming or faulty work there, they can require that the contractor expose that work by removing or demolishing what needs to be done to expose and verify that the work is compliant. If it is found to be non-compliant, then the contractor must pay to replace or repair that work in accordance to the contract documents. If it's being exposed and found that it does comply with the contract requirements, then it is up to the architect to pay for that difference. So as designers of records and architects, we want to be very certain that there is something faulty or non-compliant before we make any accusations or determination for the contractor to expose that work. During construction, the architect may prepare a request for proposal, an RFP. What this is a formal request for a change of scope to the contract. This could be either additive or subtractive, either adding to the scope of work or reducing the scope of work included. There is a standard document produced by AIA for this. It's document G709, and this document typically includes attachments which are drawings, sketches, sometimes specifications, product data sheets, anything that gives a contractor an indication of what that change of scope is going to be. An RFP change can be initiated by the architect or by the owner. When it's initiated by the architect, a lot of times it is for some correction or some change that needs to be made that they know is going to involve cost. This could be something that is coming from the plan review from the authority having jurisdiction, and the architect needs to make a change based upon that request. It may also be initiated by the owner, and with the owner a lot of times it is specific changes in their intent or desire. They may come up with something new, or they may be under budget and looking to spend extra money and adding something to the project, and they will request that the architect puts together the request for proposals to price that out or add it to the project while it's still under construction. When the contractor receives an RFP, they respond with putting together a cost and time amounts for the change in scope. Again, this could be additive or subtractive. It could also involve dollars, or it could involve time, or it can involve all. So those are the items that the general contractor is providing to the architect and owner so that they may evaluate the proposal and determine whether to proceed or not. If the owner decides to proceed with the change in contract, then it becomes a contract modification. Once a construction contract has been executed and put into place, there are only three ways to modify that. The first one is the architect's supplemental instructions, an ASI. These are simple changes that will not affect contract sum or time. It's just some minor modifications such as move a water cooler over 2 feet, or change from this material color to that material color. These are things that are just minor adjustments that are not affecting the contract time or sum. The next modification is called a change order, a CO. These are changes that will affect the contract time, sum, or both. This could be based upon an RFP mentioned previously that has been requested and decided to move forward with. Once that RFP has been approved, then it goes into becoming a change order. A change order must be signed by the owner, the architect, and the contractor before it is official and can go into effect. The final type of modification is called a construction change directive, a CCD. In some jurisdictions, this has been also referred to as an emergency change order. This is a change to the scope of work that will affect the contract sum, time, or both. It is signed by the owner and architect to force the contractor to perform the work. So this is used when there's not agreement upon terms. For example, the RFP comes back to the team, and the owner and architect think that the contractor is trying to charge too much for the work that needs to be done, or taking too long, or it's something that It just has to be done now because it's an emergency, um, uh, some unforeseen condition that needs to be addressed immediately, and we'll figure out the cost of it later, or something along those lines. So it's not really meant to be adversarial, but it is something that needs to be acted upon in order to complete the work and to negotiate the contract terms of time and cost at a later point. So a construction change directive will eventually become a change order once those terms have been worked out and all parties agree to that. The general conditions of a contract, and sometimes even by state statutes for licensed professionals in architecture and engineering, require architects to perform construction observations for general compliance with the construction documents. Observations are also used when assessing the accuracy of the contractor's pay applications. For example, if a contractor puts in their pay application pay request for 50% of masonry work, an architect should have been on site to observe whether or not 50% of the masonry work has actually been performed or not. As indicated earlier, architects may reject work that is non-compliant with construction documents. So another reason for an architect to perform construction observations is for determination if there is work that is of poor quality or non-compliant, that they can identify that. An important thing to note here is that architects are not authorized to stop work. Only the owner can do that. So if there are issues on site, the architect can advise the owner, but the architect cannot stop the work for any reason. They do not have that authority. Also important to note is that architects do not observe or report on safety issues on site. Safety is the sole responsibility of the contractor, and typically there is a site safety manager or a site superintendent who is responsible for safety. So obviously if there is an unsafe condition that an architect observes, they should simply notify the site safety manager or site superintendent and let them handle that within their own authority, and they should not include that in their reporting. It has been mentioned a few times now that one of the architect's roles during construction is to review the contractor's pay applications and make recommendations to the owner for payment. A couple bullet points in this is that typically the ownership of materials will transition from the contractor to the owner as they are incorporated into the work. So as the contractor is building the project, as the items are being put into place and installed, the pay application will pay for that certain percentage of that work that's been performed. Once the owner pays for that, it is now the ownership of the owner, no longer of the general contractor. This is why it's very important for the owner to carry builder's risk insurance, because if there was a force majeure event or an act of God during the project, the amount of materials that the owner has already paid for and has been transitioned into the building, the owner is responsible for that even though they do not have a full and completed project yet. And the builder's risk insurance helps protect the owner from that loss. The pay applications, when they're received, a typical example here is in AIA document G702. These are compared to the schedule of values, which is called the continuation sheet on G703. Again, from the very beginning, the schedule of values is the baseline. So these pay applications are compared to the schedule of values to see the percentage of work that has been completed and the amount of payment that the contractor is requesting. Here are some other contract conditions that are not typical in all construction contracts, but you should be familiar with the terms in case these do apply to a specific project. An allowance. Allowance is a dollar amount, a fiduciary amount for items that are unknown at the time of the execution of the construction contract. A good example of this may be carpet. If a owner is having a difficult time deciding on the type of carpet, the construction contract may include an allowance of $20,000 to cover carpet. And then once the owner decides on which material that they wish to use, then that specific amount can become part of the contractor's subcontract amount or vendor amount. Any unused amount of that allowance is then returned to the owner. So again, if it's $20,000 and it ends up costing $16,000, that remaining $4,000 does not belong to the contractor. That is returned back to the owner. And this is used just to make sure that there is adequate money in the bid and that all bidders are bidding the project equally with the same dollar amount. Retainage is something you will find a lot in construction contracts. This is a dollar amount that is withheld from every pay application submitted by the general contractor, and it can be typically like 5 to 10%. The purpose of this is basically acts as extra coverage to make sure that the general contractor complies with the general requirements for completing the work, and they don't go into default, which then the money may be used to rebid or hire a new contractor to complete the work. At the end of a project, then all that retainage amount, the withheld amount, is released or returned to the general contractor. Liquidated damages is a contract tool that can be used to require that the general contractor pay for any time exceeding the contract time for construction. So if they go late, if it's supposed to be a 24-month-long project, and the owner is needing that project to be done so that they can open their doors and start conducting business, and the contractor takes longer, it takes 28 months, well, the owner is then losing that potential profit, and so they apply liquidated damages to the general contractor to cover that profit. So the general contractor is paying additional money for every month or every week or every day that they are late in turning over the project. The authority having jurisdiction is responsible for ensuring public safety. They can ensure this by multiple tools. They do the plan review, they issue the building permit, and then they follow up with building inspections, typically done at intermediate and final stages of construction. These inspections will vary quite a bit based upon the authority having jurisdiction, but some common ones here are the building inspections, which is more the general inspection of the work. Special inspections, which may include things such as the steel welding inspections, elevator inspections, electrical, plumbing, fire department inspections may include fire alarms and fire suppression systems, boiler or mechanical inspections, and health department inspections. It is up to the general contractor to coordinate with the authority having jurisdiction to perform these inspections. However, the architect many times is copied on these results of these inspections as a way of documenting the process and reporting to the owner the status of the project. So if the authority having jurisdiction's building inspectors are inspecting all these separate systems, what is the architect's role? The architect is required to perform 2 building inspections to determine the following: when the project or a portion of the project is sufficiently complete to allow for owner beneficial use. Please note that this is different than the certificate of occupancy, which is issued by the authority having jurisdiction. The architect is inspecting to determine which items are incomplete or not in compliance with the contract documents. And they are inspecting to determine that when the project is complete and when the contractor is entitled to the final payment. The first inspection is called the substantial completion inspection. The purpose of this is to determine if the project is complete enough to the point of it being considered substantially complete based upon its design and intended purpose. The date of the substantial completion is determined by the architect and is the official start of the warranty period for both the project and all individual components of the project. At the time of substantial completion, there are usually some incomplete and open items, which are identified on what is typically called a punch list. The punch list should be prepared by the contractor prior to the substantial completion inspection. Those punch list items are reviewed and determined by the architect and designers of record. At the completion of the substantial completion inspection, a certificate of substantial completion should be issued. there is an AIA standard form document G704 for the Certificate of Substantial Completion. The punch list, the verified punch list, should be attached to this document and issued to both the contractor and the owner. Note that this is separate from the Certificate of Occupancy, which is issued by the authority having jurisdiction. Although the architect may issue a Certificate of Substantial Completion, the owner cannot move in and occupy the building unless there is a Certificate of Occupancy issued by the AHJ. The second inspection is to determine final completion. Final completion is when the contractor has completed the entire project in accordance to the contract documents. The inspection should not be a reinspection of previous items, but an inspection or verification that those open items of the punch list have been completed. At the point of final completion, the general contractor is entitled to the full payment and the release of all retained amounts. Full payment should only be processed with the consent of the contractor's surety agent. There are a number of documents that must be completed during the project closeout or the closing of the construction contract. As stated earlier, the Certificate of Occupancy must be issued by the authority having jurisdiction before the owner can occupy the building or premise. A final commissioning report should be issued by the commissioning authority or commissioning agent of all the findings. The general contractor should complete a release of liens to the owner, and also a consent of surety for final payment should be filled out and completed for the general contractor, especially before any retainage amounts are released. The AIA does have standard documents for these. Document G706 is the contractor's affidavit of payment of debts and liens or the release of liens. And document G707 is the consent of surety for final payment to the general contractor. Also during the project closeout phase, the architect is often involved with the collection of the following items that are given from the general contractor to the owner: any extra materials or spare parts, the operational and maintenance manuals, the O&Ms, training documents and videos, warranties, record documents, which are sometimes referred to as the as-bills, and finally the keys to the building and facility. And this is the point that we're working towards: the ribbon cutting, turning over the keys of a new facility, the completion of a construction contract, and a happy client. Thank you for your participation in TK Academy.